The Wiseman hypothesis, sometimes called the tablet theory, is a theory of the authorship and composition of the Book of Genesis which suggests that Moses compiled Genesis from tablets handed down through Abraham and the other patriarchs. Originally advocated by P. J. Wiseman in his New Discoveries in Babylonia about Genesis and republished by Wiseman's son, Donald Wiseman, as Ancient Records and the Structure of Genesis, A Case for Literary Unity in 1985, the hypothesis received some support from R. K. Harrison but otherwise remained without acceptance in scholarly circles. History. P. J. Wiseman, Air Commodore P. J. Wiseman, a British officer who visited many active archaeological sites during his career in the Middle East, found that ancient narrative tablets usually ended in colophons, which had a very specific format consisting of 3 parts. 1. This has been the history, book, genealogy of. 2. The name of the person who wrote or owned the tablet. And 3. Date passages. The book is generally divided thematically along the lines of the Toledote. What Wiseman brought new to the table was the idea that these apparent colophons indicated that Genesis had originally been a collection of narrative clay tablets written in cuneiform, like the ancient tablets he had seen, which Moses had edited into a single document on parchment or papyrus. This is in contrast with traditional views that Moses wrote Genesis entirely on his own without any outside sources, and with the documentary hypothesis that Genesis was compiled by much later and unknown redactors. Once a link had been made between the Toledoth in Genesis and the ancient colophons, another point became apparent. Just as the colophons came at the end of the narratives, so too, the Toledoths may come at the end of narratives. Thus the first of these Toledoth passages, Genesis chapter 2 verse 4, refers to the preceding creation account beginning in Genesis chapter 1, rather than being the introduction to the succeeding account. The traditional understanding has been that since nearly all the Toledoths are immediately followed by a list of descendants of the person named in the Toledoth, then the Toledoths were thought to be the beginning of sections in Genesis. In his creation revealed in 6 days, J. Wiseman argued that the days of creation represented the time period in which God took to reveal his work of creation, and that Genesis chapter 1 is an account of what God said about the things God made. It is his revelation to men about his creative acts in time past. R. K. Harrison support for the Wiseman hypothesis is found in the works on textual criticism and literary analysis of the Hebrew Bible by R. K. Harrison in his Introduction to the Old Testament, where he wrote, his Wiseman's approach, which had the distinct advantage of relating the ancient Mesopotamian sources underlying Genesis to an authentic Mesopotamian life situation, unlike the attempts of the Graf-Wellhausen school, and showed that the methods of writing and compilation employed in Genesis were in essential harmony with the processes current among the scribes of ancient Babylonia. Harrison states that these examples are discounted by scholars who follow the Wellhausen documentary hypothesis, since the central basis of the documentary hypothesis is that the Pentateuch is a work composed by unknown redactors and authors who lived much later than the time of Moses. He further states that this approach means these scholars often miss valuable information, as derived from archaeology and a knowledge of literary conventions in the ancient Near East, that help explain the biblical text. Donald Wiseman noted in the foreword to the revised edition of his father's book that since it had first been written, many more colophons have been discovered among Babylonian cuneiform texts which substantiated the use of this scribal device. Texts from Syria and Mesopotamia show continuity in tradition of scribal education and literary practices for more than 2 millennia, giving fixed and dated points. He particularly valued the implication of this theory for the early use of writing. Genesis chapters 1 to 37 could be a transcript of the oldest written records, tablets in Genesis. This is a breakdown of Genesis in two tablets delineated by colophons according to Wiseman's theory. Reception. Biblical scholar Victor Hamilton states that Wiseman's hypothesis was the first concerted attempt to challenge the hypothesis of introductory colophons. Hamilton does, however, identify several problems with what he terms the Wiseman-Harrison approach. Firstly, in 5 instances where the formula precedes a genealogy, it is difficult not to include the colophon with what follows. Secondly, the approach requires the unlikely explanation that Ishmael was responsible for preserving the history of Abraham, Isaac for Ishmael's history, Esau for Jacob's, and Jacob for Esau's. The third problem he identifies is that Genesis is narrative, not biographical, as that approach would suggest. Herbert M. Wolfe describes the theory as an attractive one, but suggests that it has serious shortcomings. Firstly, he suggests that Toledo almost always fit more naturally with the verses that they precede than with the verses that precede them. Secondly, he doubts if Moses would be able to read writing made before the Tower of Babel. Thirdly, he also suggests that the pairings of preservers and preserved histories are unlikely, given the rivalry and jealousy involved in the lack of contact between Esau and Jacob. The Bible Knowledge Commentary. Old Testament says that Wiseman's view is unconvincing, and distinguishes between the Babylonian colophons and the Toledoth of Genesis, in that the colophon is a repetition, not a description of contents, the owner named as the current owner, not the original, and the colophons do not use the Akkadian equivalent of the Toledoth as part of their formula. Books. Wiseman, J. New Discoveries in Babylonia about Genesis. London. Marsh, Morgan and Scott. Wiseman, P.J. Wiseman, D.J., ed. Ancient Records and the Structure of Genesis. A Case for Literary Unity. Nashville. Thomas Nelson, Inc. ISBN 978-0-8407-7502-3.